This is the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Matthew, the 22nd chapter. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they could find, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe, and he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This is the gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. So, full disclosure, this is a difficult parable to preach. It has come up 3 times in the lectionary cycle since I began preaching, and I have not come to a similar conclusion at any of the times. So what I say today may not be how I approach it in 3 years' time, but let's go. Parables are not always one-to-one allegories. Not every detail of the metaphor is pertinent. If I tell you that a gymnast or a dancer is like a cat, none of you think that they sleep all day and drink milk out of a bowl. You know full well that I am talking about the agility of their movement. In the same way, Jesus isn't comparing every aspect of this story to heaven, but he does say that heaven can be compared to this banquet given for the king's son. The question then is, which aspects are pertinent? What is the truth Jesus is telling us about heaven? Last week, I said that parable was not about those who were cast out. It was about the persistence of God's grace to bring about the kingdom. And this week's parable begins in similar fashion. There is an effort to subvert the banquet. Some of it is malicious. There is an attempt to kill and beat the ones who invited them, but others are simply distracted. And the point here is the persistence of the one throwing the banquet. Go and invite everyone you find. Now, depending on whether we believe this was written just before or just after the fall of Jerusalem makes a difference as to why we believe Matthew would include the detail of the destruction of the city. But in either case, it is a parable of grace. The wedding hall is filled with all they could find, both good and bad. That's how it begins. Then the king comes upon a guest who's dressed inappropriately, not wearing a wedding robe. That guest is removed, thrown into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the outer darkness is not the same thing as a medieval understanding of hell, but it's not good either. So what are the robes? The one requirement. So I hope we're all on board with the fact that this is a parable, and we're not talking about literal clothing that must be worn. We're not talking about a literal king or a literal banquet either. None of them align in perfect one-to-one correlation with the things symbolized. A dancer doesn't cough up hairballs, right? But there is symbolism. Jesus is trying to tell a truth about the kingdom of heaven, and one of those truths seems to be that there are minimum expectations for participation. Both the good and the bad are welcomed, even invited, but a wedding robe is required. So what is the robe? What is the minimum requirement the church has never established consensus about the answer to that question. Those robes have been regarded throughout the history of the church as an invocation of baptismal robes. The righteous deeds of the saints, the fruits born of the Spirit. There are parallels in language between these robes and the robes washed white in the blood of the Lamb in the revelation given to John of Patmos, and Paul uses similar language of putting on Christ to what is used here. Luther, in his characteristic self-certainty, insisted there was only one true reading, and it was the last one. The robes were unquestionably Christ himself, which must be put on by faith. I wasn't a consensus reading at that time either, but I'm not uncomfortable with it. I'm not nearly as certain as Martin appeared to be, but if you ask me today what the minimum requirement for participation in the kingdom is, I'll get an answer that is something like putting on Christ through faith. The problem is, now we have to answer what that means. There is a large distinction between putting on the actual person of Christ through faith and simply waving the symbols of the church and saying, we do this for Jesus, as we go about worshiping the ways of wealth and power and comfort. Clarifying that distinction is basically just another way of asking, what are the robes? What is the minimum requirement? And I asked that question this week in Bible studies and online, and I got as many different answers as I did dodges of the question. Looking at it, it seems to me that the way we answer this question says more about us than the parable. What do we think the one important thing is? And it occurs to me, the truth Jesus might be telling us about the kingdom of heaven isn't about a specific mandatory requirement. Maybe the important truth is that grace is indeed free, but God's kingdom is not without standards. Them's fighting words in Lutheran circles. We're justified by grace through faith. End of story, right? That's going to be the centerpiece of a lot of Lutheran preaching in 2 weeks' time when we commemorate the Reformation. That's why many of my colleagues, they're flipping the traditional reading of this parable as has become popular in recent time. I mean, Jesus says we may compare this to the kingdom of heaven. Maybe it's a foil, an antithesis. Maybe Jesus is the one who showed up at the banquet, refusing to wear the customary marks of religious pedigree, and was cast out into the darkness of Gethsemane, Calvary, where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's a serious biblical reading. Far heavier hitting theologians than myself have suggested it. It's worth investigating, if for no other reason than discovering which biblical biases within ourselves we may encounter. But it's not how I read it, at least not today. I find it to be too convenient. Let us off the hook. Let those of us who heard that call to radical hospitality, to love, who heard that call and said, but seriously, there are realistic things that must be dealt with, business to take care of. And it lets us off the hook. It lets those of us off the hook who think we can come to the banquet, partake in the festivities, and remain unchanged. A gospel that does not reach deep into our chest and break the chains placed around our heart is not a gospel. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famous Lutheran pastor, theologian, and activist, coined the phrase cheap grace to describe the good German Lutherans that preached justification through faith in church on Sunday morning and then walked blissfully past a concentration camp on their way to their Sunday afternoon meal. Grace is free, but it has a cost. The cost is the way that it changes us into the kind of people who cannot ignore what is before us, who will put our lives on the line if need be for another. See, perhaps the important thing about the robes isn't their specific nature, but the fact that they are noticeable from across the room. The invitation alone affected the guest in demonstrable, noticeable fashion. And yet, just preach the gospel, so many churchgoers demand of pastors who call for demonstrable change. Radical, fearless love, the kind that will let them know we are Christians, regardless of what comes out of our mouths. Just preach the gospel. Don't be so political, they say. And they're not talking about political parties. What they mean is, can you just say the pretty Jesus words up there and let me remain unchanged? To me, this parable says, don't bother coming if you want to remain unchanged. If we want to continue to look at our enemies and feel no obligation to love them, don't bother coming. If we want to cling to our sense of accomplishment, of worth, of self-value, don't bother coming. If we want it to be about whether or not I am worthy, don't bother coming. But on the other hand, we're open to being changed, placing our hearts out on the table for God to do with what God will do with it, and becoming just another person in the kingdom. Then the feast is ready. And all, both good and bad, are welcome, even invited. And at least for this year, that's where I'm at with this parable. Peace be with you.